Elaine has a PhD in freshwater ecology from Trinity and an advanced diploma in planning and environmental law from King's Inn. She's a steering committee member of the Environmental Pillar and a director of the Sustainable Water Network.
If I had seen a talk on planning and environmental law just a couple of years back, there's no way I would have signed up for it, to be honest. But in my time at An Taisce, I've realised that it's one of the strongest tools that we have in our toolkit. And I'm hoping by the end of this, you'll see where I'm coming from. I'll do my best to make it more interesting than the title sounds. So James has already done my intro for me, that I'm Elaine McGoff. I'm the Natural Environment Officer with An Taisce. I've been with them for 3.5 years. And his outlined that I work on a range of different issues, and I cover a little bit of everything in my job. And I'm really lucky that in An Taisce I work with a lot of really knowledgeable colleagues, including some of the leading climate experts in Ireland. And to be honest, I'm still learning every single day. There's always more to know. But having said that, at the end of this, I'll do my best to answer your questions. So again, James has covered some of this. Who are An Taisce? We were founded in 1948 and we're one of Ireland's oldest environmental organisations. And we're divided into two main branches: the Education Unit, which runs the likes of green schools and clean coasts, and the Advocacy Unit, which deals with planning and advocacy, obviously. The Education Unit gets government funding to run its programmes, and the Advocacy Unit depends almost entirely on donations and people becoming members of An Taisce. So thank you to all of our members who are in the audience here tonight. A lot of people don't realise that An Taisce are a charity, and I think until recently, maybe a lot of people probably didn't know what it was that we did or why we met. Our image is probably of dusty old men wearing tweed, worrying about old buildings, and historically, to be fair, that might have been the case, but it's far from the situation now. As James outlined, we're a prescribed body for planning, which means we're written into the planning regulations. So if any development is likely to have an environmental impact, we are consulted. It doesn't mean we're listened to, but we're invited to make our views known. And we're the only ENGO with this status in Ireland, and we take it very seriously, despite getting no government funding to do it. So we would comment on hundreds of planning, forestry and aquaculture submissions every year. Now, given that this talk is on agriculture, I'm going to just focus on that, but we do work across a range of developments from data centres to floods and so on. We don't just pick on agriculture, but it has to be acknowledged that intensive agriculture, particularly dairy, is the biggest pressure on water quality, biodiversity and carbon emissions. And to that end, I just want to show you a graph to illustrate how disproportionate Ireland's dairy expansion has been and how rapidly it has expanded over the last decade compared to other EU countries. Now, I appreciate that this graph is quite small, but I think you can all see the green bar at the end, which represents Ireland. And when you compare to all the other bars, it's really quite striking. Since 2010, there has been a 41% increase in dairy cows, and the majority of that has happened in Leinster and in Munster. And synthetic fertilizer has increased in lockstep with this. It has increased by more than 33% in the same time period. Part of this is due to dairy quotas being lifted in 2015, which up until then had kept a kind of a lid on dairy expansion. And government policy and advisors, once it was lifted, they all encouraged farmers to go for it, which is how we've ended up where we are. Farmers did what they were advised to do. This has resulted in serious ecological pressure. And I just want to walk through some of the headline pressures and stats. I'm sure a lot of you know this already, but just to cover the basics. A lot of people, I'll talk first about water quality. A lot of people talk about the biodiversity and climate crisis, but water quality is equally in crisis. It just doesn't have as much of a voice. The main pressure on water quality is increased nutrient pollution from phosphorus and nitrogen. And these come mainly from slurry, fertilizer and wastewater discharges. The impacts, when you have a water body that's impacted by these, it's not always obvious from looking at them, but the enrichment impacts on the structure and function of the water ecosystem. So it'll kill off the more sensitive species like dragonflies and mayflies, which have really important roles in the water body, like shredding leaf litter or preying on other insects and keeping their population in check. So when these things go, you end up with proliferation of worms and fly larvae, and they just don't do the same thing. The ecosystem doesn't function in the same way, and the river slowly starts to die. And ultimately, you may end up with something resembling pea soup, where the algae just takes over and blocks out the light and the rest from the rest of the water body and killing off any other plants. We are on our way to this in a lot of our rivers, particularly in the south and the southeast. You can see in this image, again, I appreciate that it's small, but you can see that in the south and southeast, there's a lot of orange and red dots, and they indicate elevated nitrogen. There's a clear spatial pattern. This is a map from the EPA. The EPA published a report just last month on water quality, and it was one of their strongest statements yet, highlighting the concerns about the impact of agriculture on water quality, particularly in this area, in the south and the southeast. These impacts, it's impacting on some of our most well-known rivers. So the Three Sisters, the Barrow, the Nore, the Shore, the Slaney, Blackwater, Bandon, and Lee in Cork. And the pace of change is breathtaking. In the last 10 years, nitrogen concentrations have increased in nearly 90% of the river catchments sampled. And the data show that in rural catchments, more than 85% of nitrogen is from agriculture as a result of slurry and fertilizers. So it's not a good picture. Biodiversity, we have EU legislation that, but we are failing to do that too, with the National Parks and Wildlife Service reporting in 2019 that 85% of our most protected habitats are in unfavorable conservation status. Over 70% of these are impacted by agricultural pressure, with intensive grazing being the most prevalent pressure. Now, what many people think is emblematic of Ireland are green fields. They're often just green deserts, offering little or no biodiversity and not much in the way of useful habitat. They're that green because they're soaked in synthetic fertilizer to grow monoculture ryegrass. So the picture on the left here is a good example of that. I'm sure it will be used by the tourism board to show how lovely and green Ireland is. But when I see that, I just see a lack of habitat. Changing farming methods and intensification are leading to catastrophic declines of farmland birds, especially breeding waders like curlew and lapwing. We're losing species, rich grasslands and high nature value farmland, which are really important for flora and fauna. And a third of our bee species are threatened with extinction by 2030 due to wildflower loss and spraying across the board. That's not just for agriculture. So, the problem is also that there's farming policies like CAP also incentivize habitat destruction, with farmers penalized for having non-productive areas on their land, like wetlands and scrub. And tellingly, the EU Court of Auditors also found that CAP funding on biodiversity had not achieved anything. So again, along with water quality, biodiversity, the picture isn't looking too good. Now let's talk about ammonia. Ammonia is a gaseous form of nitrogen, and it's the you probably know it if you don't do. 99% of it in Ireland agriculture from slurry and fertilizers, and splash plate slurry spreading is a huge driver of it. Ireland's ammonia levels have been in breach of EU thresholds since 2012, apart from 1 year, and there's no credible plan to get it under control. The problem with ammonia is that it's a toxic gas, and it combines with other pollutants to form PM2.5, one of the most dangerous and deadly types of air pollution particles. And this small particulate matter is well known to be harmful to health. It penetrates deep into the lungs, and it's linked to higher death rate, respiratory problems, cardiovascular diseases, cognitive decline, and low birth weights. And a recent study found that at least 3,000 premature deaths could have been prevented annually in the UK by cutting ammonia emissions in half. 3,000 deaths. So it's no laughing matter. And the gas also poses a serious threat to biodiversity, with well-established links between ammonia, elevated ammonia, and biodiversity loss. It can cause soil acidification and runoff of polluting nitrates into nearby water bodies, and it also pollutes some of our most pristine habitats like bogs and heaths, resulting in algal slime, like you can see in this picture at the top. The tree trunk is covered with algal slime, and killing off our most sensitive species like lichens and mosses. And in the bottom right picture, you can see in one hand, he's holding healthy sphagnum, in the other, he's holding sphagnum that's essentially dead because of ammonia deposition. So it damages whole ecosystems. It's bad for humans, and it's bad for nature. And finally, we have greenhouse gas emissions. And I'm sure you're all really familiar with this. Agriculture is the single largest contributor to Ireland's greenhouse gas emissions, and it accounts for approximately 37% of the total. Agriculture accounted for 93% of total methane emissions in 2019, and dairy cows produce significantly more methane than other cattle, because there's a linear relationship between milk production and methane emissions. The more milk produced, the more methane emitted. Worryingly, Teagasc have projected that dairy cow numbers will reach 1.7 million by 2027. That's up 12.6% from 1.4 million in 2019, which it's really very worrying. And it's also important to note that the emissions don't just come from animals. Agricultural land is also a net emitter of carbon at the moment because of land drainage of organic soils. So it's worth bearing in mind that the flip side of farmers being rewarded for carbon sequestration could be penalties for carbon loss, which would negatively impact on a huge range of farmers. So now you know what all the main pressures are from agriculture. The question is, what difference does planning and the law make to this? Well, first of all, it's really important to note that there are EU directives governing all of the pressures I've just outlined. For water, we have the Water Framework Directive, which requires good water status by 2027. We have the Nitrates Directive, which is meant to prevent water pollution from agriculture and promote good farming practice. We have the Habitats Directive, which protects our birds, habitats and species. We have the National Emission Ceilings Directive, which sets thresholds for air pollutants like ammonia. And we have the Paris Agreement limiting GHGs. Agricultural intensification is one of the main drivers putting us in breach of all of these. So you could reasonably ask, what is planning doing about that? Well, decision makers, like in local authorities and on Board Pleanála, they're obliged to assess compliance with these directives in making their decisions. It's particularly strong in the Habitats Directive. There's been a lot of case law around it, and the planners have to be able to conclude beyond reasonable doubt that there will be no impact on a protected site or a protected species. It's our strongest legal tool at the moment. You hear of Peter Sweetman taking a lot of cases. A lot of times his grounds will be based on the Habitats Directive. It's taken very seriously. The Water Framework Directive, it didn't have much teeth until a recent case, again taken by Peter Sweetman, which has changed the legal landscape somewhat. It's made planners much more aware of the Water Framework Directive, and they need to take it into account now in making their planning decisions. There is no standalone assessment for GHGs or ammonia, but if you need an environmental impact assessment, which is necessary for certain kind of larger projects or potentially more damaging projects, it will assess water quality, GHGs, air quality, and biodiversity. And of course, there's a new climate bill, which will allocate sectoral budgets, which could have serious implications for agriculture. So we have a lot of laws, which should, in theory, put limits on agricultural emissions. However, you knew there was going to be however. A lot of farm activities don't need to go through planning, so they're not always scrutinized in the same way. For example, building a milking parlour, you'd have to get planning, but you don't need planning permission to increase your herd size. That's where agricultural policy comes in. It also needs to align with EU directives. And although in practice that has categorically not been the case for agricultural policy in Ireland to date, so much so that An Taisce have lodged a legal infringement complaint with the European Commission due to the environmental impact of the current agri-food strategy, Foodwise 2025. Legally, they're meant to mitigate for unforeseen environmental impacts and have done no such thing. All of our environmental indicators have nosedived over the lifetime of the strategy we have at the moment and continue to do so. The next iteration is called Agri-Food 2030, and it's also business as usual, depending on export-driven bovine agriculture, often cultivating markets in countries which traditionally may not eat much beef or dairy, or cultivating markets for baby formula to the detriment of breastfeeding in those countries. You can see in the quotes here, these are taken directly from the agri-food strategy. They say that the core of Ireland's agri-food output should continue to be grass-based livestock production. And given that 80 to 90% of output is exported, the long-standing policy of supplying an increasingly diversified range of export markets and developing high-value markets will continue. our comment on that was that the only thing Ireland is a leader in is the intensive production of dairy, with the outsourcing of huge environmental and social costs to the Irish public, while the agri-food industry pockets profits. So where we're at is we have Foodwise 2025, which isn't good, and the Agri-Food 2030 strategy, which, to be honest, doesn't look like it's going to be much better. But like projects, these plans, like the Ag-Food Strategy Plan, they are also subject to scrutiny under the Habitats Directive, and they undergo strategic environmental assessment. And An Taisce reviewed the latest agri-food strategy. It was out for public consultation in the last couple of weeks. And our assessment is that it's not up to scratch. And there's serious legal flaws in their assessments, in our opinion. And it could, and I believe it could, and I hope it will be subject to legal challenge. The environmental pillar, of which An Taisce is a member, we did input to the drafting process for well over a year. We were allocated one seat and told who we could send along, which is Karen Szylski, the CEO of the environmental pillar. And we inputted tirelessly. We put in like massive submissions, drawing on all of our expertise. And at the end of the day, we felt like none of it was taken into account. We were doing our best to change the direction of travel and to engage in good faith, but ultimately it was a stacked deck and it was a done deal before we even sat down at the table. So we had to walk away to make sure we weren't seen to be endorsing it. So how do An Taisce use all of this in our submissions, in our hundreds of planning submissions and forestry and aquaculture submissions? Well, we get environmental assessments referred to us. So when the planning authority ask for our opinion, they will send us all the documents. There'll usually be various environmental assessments along with them. And it's not, also just to highlight, it's not just planning applications that we deal with. We also review things like agricultural strategy plans and county development plans in the same way. So we basically go through them and carefully assess what they say, what they've assessed, what data they've relied on, and what the nearby ecological sensitivities are. So we're basically sort of acting like detectives, using as much information as we can find online. And sometimes we get tip-offs from members of the public, which is really quite helpful. So we put in our submissions to the local authority or the relevant body, highlighting what the flaws are or what data or analysis is missing. Everything we do is science-based and framed by the law, which often manifests as dry legalistic submissions, but we're speaking in the planning language for greatest impact. The law and scientific data is fundamental to our work, and if we can't strongly pin our argument to EU legislation and case law, then our arguments are far weaker. Bear with me for 1 second. We rely, so as I said, we rely very heavily on the science. We cross-reference with the EPA data on nearby water quality or the National Parks and Wildlife Service data on what the nearby protected habitats or species are. And in a lot of circumstances for standard planning, our submissions would lead to the local authority requesting further information for the applicants to fill in the gaps which we have highlighted. It's also worth highlighting that we do get a lot of requests for help from community groups and individuals in regard to really special biodiverse areas which are under threat from development. But without a really strong legal stance to underpin our argument, it's hard to make much headway. Things like hedgehogs and non-legally protected species don't hold much water with the decision makers. To be honest, it's hard enough to get them to protect even our most threatened and most highly protected species. But if you can link the project to a protected habitat or a species, then it's a much easier argument to make, and your chances of a successful outcome for the environment are far higher. If after all of this, all of our input, if the development is granted by the local authority and we have outstanding concerns, like serious concerns about the project, then we pay to appeal it to An Bord Pleanála. And they look at the facts of the case all over again, and they start from scratch and look at all of the information in front of them, and they reach their own decision. And at that stage, we again outline our concerns, drawing on all of the different things that I have highlighted. And they will make a decision independent of what the planning authority have said. If they make a decision which we very, 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 very strongly feel is not in keeping with the legislation, then our only option would be to take it to the courts to seek a judicial review. Which I have to say, you don't take a judicial review lightly. It's a huge undertaking. You can't challenge a decision because you don't like it. You can only challenge it if you think the process was flawed. So it's primarily concerned with the decision-making process rather than the substance of the decision. It's a really high bar to take a JR. JR is a short for judicial review, just so I don't lose you. It's a really high bar to take a JR, and you have to prove you have good grounds for taking the challenge and that you have what they call standing, which means you're entitled to take the case. Judges do not look kindly on frivolous or what they call vexatious JRs. The system is designed to screen those out at the beginning. You have to apply for leave to take a JR. You essentially have to ask for permission, the judge's permission to proceed and to take a JR. And the judge assesses all of these things from the get-go. They decide from the outset what your grounds are and if you're eligible to take the challenge. Now, we are really lucky to have some very gifted and generous lawyers who represent us on a no-fault, no-fee basis, which means that they don't get paid unless we win the case. So in practice, they only take cases that they think they have a relatively good chance of winning. There is a certain amount of financial protection when you take an environmental case in Ireland with something called one-way cost shifting, which means in practice, in certain circumstances, when you take an environmental case, if you lose, you don't have to pay the other side's costs, but if you win, they have to pay yours. But you're never 100% certain you'll get cost protection. There's always an element of financial risk involved. For example, if the judge finds that your case isn't fully within the criteria for cost protection, where only part of it is, then you're liable for the other side's costs. And legal costs are eye-watering. So again, it's not something you undertake lightly. An Taisce have taken roughly 10 cases over the last decade, but we've won them all, although we did have to go to the Supreme Court in 4 instances to achieve a successful outcome. Now, this clearly doesn't mean we'll always win, but it highlights that when we do take cases, they have merit. We know what we're about, and so do our lawyers. Which, of course, leads me to the cheese factory, the Glanbia Royalaware case. Now, I'm limited in what I can say here because it's still live, but I'll just explain the background. Royalaware are a Dutch company which want to form a partnership with Glanbia to build a cheese factory in Kilkenny, producing Gouda with Irish milk and exporting it to Europe. Now, it's worth noting that the Netherlands has hugely cracked down on dairy production because of water quality and ammonia concerns. And some would say that Royalaware are coming here because we have less stringent environmental regulations, that it's a form of pollution dumping. Ireland is seen as a soft target. The plant would need 450 million litres of milk per year to run it. And we raise concerns about the indirect impact of that increased milk production. The increased milk production that would be needed to run the plant. The planning authority essentially said that it would be too difficult to assess it, as there would be so many farms producing the milk, and on board Planola agreed. Now, the map here on the top right, again, you won't see the detail, but it's just, these are all the producers for Glanbia. That's kind of the spread of Glanbia farmers across Ireland. In a previous case with a peat power plant in Eden Derry, we had successfully argued before the court that the peat harvesting to feed the power plant was an essential part of the operation. It had to be assessed as part of the project. If you didn't have the peat, you wouldn't have the plant. We were relying on that same logic here, that the plant can't run without the milk, therefore the impact of the milk must be assessed. The milk production, it was vital for the project. It should undergo the same environmental scrutiny. So On Board Planola didn't agree with us. So we then took a judicial review, seeking clarity on what the correct assessment is under EU law. Should the indirect effects have been assessed or not? And if not, where do you draw the line in terms of deciding that an indirect effect is too remote from the project? Like where is the boundary? The peat was important for the peat plant. Why does that same logic not apply here? Because it's really important for everyone to understand this going forward. Now, I'm not going to comment on the specifics of the judgment. But suffice it to say, the judge ruled against us. But we felt that our question on what the correct standard of assessment is was still outstanding. And we also felt it muddied the water in regard to more recent case law. His judgment conflicted with it, and it meant that any future judges would have a hard time deciding which precedent to rely on. It undermined some helpful recent case law, yeah, I guess judges generally rely on judgments that went before them. One judgment builds on another. So there's generally a clear logic for judges to rely on, but the problem with this judgment was that it made things less clear, and it will lead to issues down the line if this isn't clarified. Now, I'm not sure that there's anyone in the country who doesn't know at this stage that we appealed this judgment. But an oddity of the Irish court system is that you have to go back to the same judge and get his approval to appeal his judgment. So you essentially have to persuade him that he should allow another judge to critique his judgment, which strikes me as a very odd system. The judge since decided that he would not grant us a certificate to proceed to the Court of Appeal. So we're not allowed to take it to the appeal court. That's where we currently are. Our options now are to walk away or to apply to the Supreme Court. And no decision has been taken yet, as it needs really serious consideration by the Board of An Taisce in conjunction with legal advice. But we will have to make a decision one way or the other in the next couple of weeks. However, I would highlight that our decision will not be based on political opinion or pressure. It'll just be based on the law and the board's decision. Now, I'd like to give you an example of a successful outcome by an environmental NGO in this type of case, and one which fundamentally changed agricultural policy. So I'll take you to the Netherlands. In 2015, the Dutch government came up with an action plan to protect their most important nature sites from nitrogen pollution. The Netherlands has a large dairy industry too, larger than in Ireland, and the government plan was heavily criticised. And within 2 years, a small environmental NGO went to the European Court of Justice to challenge the plan, arguing that it failed to protect nature and that it wasn't legal. The courts ruled in the NGO's favour. Dutch politicians had to act, and thousands of industrial developments, including an airport, were halted. Driving speed limits were reduced to cut nitrogen oxide. Livestock agriculture accounted for 46% of nitrogen pollution in the Netherlands, and the government offered farmers money to quit. There was uproar among farmers who were paying the price of bad government planning, and they took to the streets in their tractors, and you can see a picture of it here on the top left. Dutch industry experts predict that by 2030, the volume of milk produced may decrease by up to 30% if the sector doesn't reach its nitrogen reduction targets. And regulators will have to cut the herd if they don't reach those targets. The Dutch agri-industry is now dealing with the reality of producing food when polluting nutrients such as nitrogen are the new limits. And it's not easy because they ignored the warnings for 20 years until finally the courts cut them off, essentially overnight, which impacted farmers more than anyone else. Ireland has yet to recognise these same limits, both legally and ecologically. While agriculture is admittedly more intensive in the Netherlands, with the speed of expansion here and the fact that it's concentrated in the south and southeast, we are headed in the same direction. And based on what we've seen in the latest agri-food strategy, it's going to be business as usual for as long as they can get away with it. And given that the Irish government are so unwilling to face up to the challenge in front of them, it is likely that it will be up to the courts to force their hand. The science and the law is against them, and I believe it's just a matter of time before a successful challenge is taken. And then farmers will have to pay the price of bad planning by successive governments who are heavily lobbied and influenced by agribusiness. And before I wrap up, I just want to draw your attention to one thing, and that's planning reform. And before you fall asleep, it probably sounds incredibly boring, but bear with me. If you pay attention to the papers, you'll see multiple articles on how there's an avalanche of judicial reviews and they're taken frivolously and it's too easy and they're bad for business, and that the planning system is broken and needs to be speeded up. The planning system is very slow, I will admit that. But the way to fix it is to make the correct, legally compliant decisions from the get-go. So then no challenges are necessary, or much fewer are necessary. Instead, what the government want to do is limit who can challenge these flawed decisions. Access to justice is a fundamental right in the Convention on Human Rights and under the Aarhus Convention, but it won't be enough to stop the government from shutting this down. The proposals that they want to implement would stop a lot of people having the right to take a challenge, so it would reduce standing, including many environmental NGOs. It would also put a cap on costs, which might sound good, but that means that if we are looking for lawyers to represent us on a no fault, no fee basis, they won't get their full fees if we win. They'll just get a fraction of them. So the other side would pay a certain percentage, and we don't have the money to top that up. So it would undoubtedly limit how much representation environmental NGOs can get. I mean, lawyers also need to pay their bills. They need to get paid. So you may not care about any of this, or it may seem irrelevant to you, but if you look around the world at how court cases are changing, they're changing the face of the environmental battle and giving environmental campaigners teeth. And if that's taken away from us, we really need to worry about the government trying to shut down this process. So a planning bill is going to come before the Dáil in the next couple of months, and you will see environmental NGOs campaigning on this. I'm hoping this talk has given you an idea of just why the law and access to justice is so important. So please lend whatever you support you can to us in that campaign. Because at the moment, in lieu of the government taking responsibility for the environment, the courts are proving to be our best course of action. We need to defend that right to the bitter end. If this legislation passes, it will potentially be one of the biggest blows to the environmental movement and will significantly change the future of environmental justice. Environmental law will have far less teeth. Finally, I just wanted to say a big thank you. I know it was a bit dense, but I hope it was useful and interesting and that you're walking away knowing a bit more about planning. I also want to say a big thank you on behalf of An Taisce. It's been a real roller coaster the past couple of weeks, and having the support of groups such as yourselves has really boosted our morale in the face of quite incredible political pushback. And also to say that groups like yourselves taking direct action and protesting on the streets, it's really helping to shine a spotlight on this, and it's changing the conversation. And I hope that with our powers combined, we can make a difference. Agriculture doesn't have to be so damaging, and farmers are not the enemy. Agricultural policy is. So we need the grown-ups in the room to figure out how to chart a new way forward that protects the environment and supports farmers. It won't be easy, but it can be done. What we're lacking is the political will. The writing is on the wall for intensive dairy. The politicians just haven't read it yet. And if you'll allow me, I want to just end on some words from a piece I wrote called Hope Floats, about the challenge of holding on to hope as an environmental advocate and the importance of our community. There are days when the hope is dim and I am battle weary. And it is on those days that I depend on this community of ours to keep believing in the work we do, to keep striving until I find my voice again. Níneart go cur le chéile. There's no strength without unity. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Elaine, for that excellent, informative presentation. Now we have time for questions. Now there was a question put in the chat box by Harold Kingston. It says that you said that some would say Ireland has less stringent environmental rules than the Netherlands. So why do you say that, Elaine?
Why do I say that? The regulations, I guess, are the same, but the enforcement of them is far more lax here. And I say that based on what's happening in the Netherlands, that the government have been taken to court and they have been told that they need to comply with the regulations, and the dairy industry is really feeling the brunt of that. So that hasn't happened yet in Ireland. We're still breaching our directives left, right and centre. So, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that we are taking a more lax approach than the Netherlands are.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Jerry Boland, you've got your hand up there. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, thanks, James, and thank you, Elaine. That was absolutely brilliant. Very informative. It's very, very encouraging to know that you and An Taisce are on the case, because as a campaigner, sometimes it feels pretty despairing, to be honest with you. even getting a sentence covered anywhere about it. I've got a particular interest in factory farming and ending it. Not hope of that happening soon. So I have a particular interest in pigs and poultry in that respect. And I was just wondering, has An Taisce done any work on, like, because you have it done on dairy, which is properly so. Have you done any work on the environmental effects of pig and poultry production, in particular in relation to the environment and climate change, etc.?
Yeah, for poultry, we would be looking at ammonia impacts, and in particular transboundary impacts. So between Northern Ireland and the Republic, you get a lot of pig and poultry farms just along the border, both on the south and on the north. So we would, and those require EPA integrated pollution control licenses. So the factories themselves go through, they go through a reasonably rigorous planning system, and we would comment on those and critique those and point out all of the problems. The issue is that slurry, pig slurry, doesn't fall within the integrated pollution control license. So the Department of Agriculture should regulate pig slurry spreading. Sorry. And at the moment it's a paper exercise, and the information isn't that readily accessible. So I think the impacts of dairy the EPA have more data, I think, on the impacts of dairy intensification than they do potentially on pig slurry. But we don't have a policy as such on pig farms or on poultry farms. We would just kind of do a case by case. As we get an application for a poultry farm, we would assess it, and there's standard things we look at: transboundary, ammonia, water quality, and we raise those issues repeatedly.
Yeah, thanks, Elaine. If I can just come back to you on that, the reason I'm raising is because it's not a small industry. Like, these are big industries. The pig
Absolutely.
industry is huge. The poultry industry, nearly 100 million broiler chickens a year. These are big industries, obviously producing enormous amounts of pollution, apart from the animal rights fiasco that goes on there. So I'm just kind of making the point that it probably would be good to have that kind of data.
It would be issues trying to get it, to be honest. If I am correct, my information is that for, say, pig slurry spreading, that it's, I think it's hard form applications that go to the Department of Agriculture. I don't think that the data is available electronically. That might be about to change. And like there's an article recently, a Guardian article, talking about Northern Ireland exporting their pig slurry down here. It's also even written into planning applications sometimes. Northern Ireland, they would say, oh, we're going to send our pig slurry down south. And they're meant to consult with us because there's transboundary impacts, but they don't. So it would very much, I absolutely agree, Jerry, it would be good to have the information on that, but it's easier said than done.
Thanks, Elaine. Perhaps, Jerry, there's some kind of freedom of information request that could be put into the Department of Agriculture to seek that information. That's something. One question that I would have, Elaine, is got to do with, there is this structure both with the Common Agricultural Policy in Europe. On the Common Agricultural Policy is negotiated and funded, it seems to be, in a separate way to the Habitats Directive, the Water Framework Directive, and so on. So often you've got massive funding in the Common Agricultural Policy, and for the monitoring and oversight of the directives, there isn't funding for monitoring them. Do An Taisce, do you have any thoughts or comments on that?
No, I guess it's just symptomatic of the silo approach. And you see it very much in Ireland. You have the Department of Agriculture doing their thing, then you have the Department of Housing, where the National Parks and Wildlife Service are now, and they're doing their thing. And then you have water quality, and they're doing their thing. And none of them are really talking to each other very much. And there's a real lack of policy coherence. So, you'll have the National Parks and Wildlife and Malcolm Noonan saying they're going to do one thing, and then the Department of Agriculture, their policies are driving things very much the other direction. So it's a real problem. And you know, the National Parks and Wildlife Service, their funding is pretty pathetic. So I don't know how we're going to achieve the protection we need unless nature starts to be taken more seriously, and that's just not happening.
Do you think, like, on the one hand, a lot of companies are, you know, declaring they're going to be net zero, and some of the claims they're making are just marketing and so on. But at the same time, nature-based climate solutions do exist, and they can be powerful, and they can allow landowners to benefit if appropriate balanced funding is given to landowners for that kind of work. Is that something you could see happening in our context?
I absolutely agree that nature-based climate solutions do exist, and you know, it's very hard. By the biodiversity crisis and the carbon crisis, climate crisis are, you know, inextricably linked. The problem is, if it comes to just carbon sequestration in land, and calculating land carbon, it sounds simple, but it's really not. And if public money goes to it, we need to be very certain that additional carbon is being stored and that it remains stored. So in reality, it's really difficult to achieve such certainty. It required reliable, ongoing and repeated measurement and verification, which would be really costly. And of course, land carbon is really vulnerable to re-release. Like if you've got trees planted, they get blown over or they get a disease and die, then that carbon is released again. But I do think farmers should absolutely be rewarded for protecting something that's far more tangible, like water quality and biodiversity. There are many farmers with low input farms providing habitats for birds and other species and protection for water quality, and they are not getting the support they need to keep going, and that needs to change. So focusing on highly uncertain land removals instead of tackling the crises on hand, the biodiversity crisis that we know exactly what we need to do. It seems like not quite a distraction, but it seems like let's focus on where we know we can absolutely get results instead of giving more money to a slightly uncertain carbon sequestration model.
Okay, thank you. If there are no further questions, does anybody want to ask a final question?
I have a question.
Yeah,
I don't know if you can see
Tracy.
my hand there. Elaine, I wondered, this move that was initiated by Polly Higgins and has been carried on post her demise to make ecocide a crime in the International Criminal Court, is that something that you would hold out hope for as being really something that maybe Ireland could help contribute to, and might actually make a difference?
I don't know enough about the legal, if it's been fleshed out legally, so it's hard for me to say how much teeth it would have. Ireland doesn't have a good reputation in terms of international law or international agreements at actually sticking to their word. So it would really depend if it could be turned into like a European or a national law that really that had teeth. If it did, then I do hold out hope. If it doesn't, you know, Ireland is really not in good. It's really not good at enforcement. I think there's a senior judge who said that Ireland are the state, the government are the worst offenders for breaking EU law. So for it to be helpful, for me to have hope for it, it needs to have big sharp teeth.
Right, okay. Or for instance, the scrap factory farming initiative that they're doing in the UK now, I was thinking that, you know, with the UK being just beyond our border, is that something that we could cooperate on, or are the two jurisdictions making that too complicated for us to be able to try and do something legally in that way?
Oh, Brexit. I think they'll probably just say Brexit. Brexit seems to have gotten in the way of everything. But I think it's really interesting, and we can definitely learn from them because they are, I mean, we are more dairy based, but it's still, you know, we have a lot of shared history. We're not that different to each other. So I think we take a lot of learnings from how they're doing it and what they achieve, and if we can do the same here.
I think Natasha has raised her hand. Natasha, do you want to ask a question?
Yes, sorry. I'll just put my video on so you can see me. I'm not really sure, sorry, the video, what the status of the Citizens Assembly on Biodiversity. But one of the things I know Pádraig Fogarty from the Irish Wildlife Trust was talking about was trying to get biodiversity enshrined in the Constitution, or at least nature in some ways. Maybe you could comment on that?
Yeah, the Citizens Assembly on Biodiversity is meant to kick off in Q1 of next year, all going well. In terms of having it enshrined in the Constitution, that would be amazing. I mean, there was the case where, let me
Friends
think
of the Irish Environment.
Yes, exactly,
Yeah.
and the right to a
healthy environment.
Yeah, so it wasn't written into the Constitution. It's an unenumerated right as far it's legal language. So they haven't quite gone as far as writing it down, but it's sort of a given that that's there. So I think it could happen. I don't know how you achieve it though. I mean, that they went to court to do that, so I don't know if it needs to be knitted into another court case. But I think it would be really helpful. And I think really, I mean, I don't think you need climate in one corner and nature in the other. I think you could really just wrap them in together, and a healthy environment would cover nature and biodiversity as much as it would climate and water.
Any other final questions? Okay. Okay, everybody. So just really, Elaine, again, just to thank you very much for your presentation this evening. I'll just pass back to Tracy just for 2 seconds for some brief announcements.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you to everyone who came. We had a great turnout for this tonight, which I know really owes so much to Elaine and the interest in her work and the topic. But we appreciate everyone who came out for Animal Rebellion as well, and we hope that you will continue to come out for our events. As far as the talks go, we're going to take a break in August, but we're going to be back in September, probably again the second Tuesday of the month. But before that, we have a film club in 2 weeks from tonight. We're going to be screening Akya, which is a film by the Oscar award-winning director Bong Joon-ho about a young girl who battles a powerful multinational company to save her best friend, who is a giant pig. So what's not to love there? I'm sure you'll all want to be there for that. You can get free tickets for that on Eventbrite. That's up there now as an event. And we just hope you'll continue to follow us on social media. And when we are out there on the street, we would love it if you would join us and support us in our quest for a plant-based future. And I'll be sending out a copy of this recording for everyone here, and of Elaine's slides as well. So thank you very much for turning up. And thank you again, Elaine. It was really great of you to take this time for this.